Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for this edition of the Discourse. And this week, we're going to be chatting about cybersecurity and artificial intelligence and how those two realms have collided in the past and how the rise of artificial intelligence and machine learning is forcing cybersecurity and cybercrime itself to evolve. And joining us, we have an expert from Sophos. John, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the Discourse.
Thanks a lot, Brendan. It's great to be here. And glad to we can talk about this today. AI is definitely one of these topics that is gathering a lot of steam these days, specifically in cybersecurity. So let's dive right into it.
Yeah, so just for our listeners, who are you and what do you do at Sophos?
Yeah, so as you said, my name's John Shier, and I am a field CTO for threat intelligence at Sophos. So what that basically means is I'm charged with trying to understand the threat landscape and how it impacts both our customers, but also the world at large. And then finally, out of that, try to understand what is it that we can do about some of these things, right? So there's certainly a lot of aspects of cybersecurity that are tried and true. Obviously things like, you got to patch your systems, right? You got to make sure your systems are well maintained.
Yeah.
You've got to make sure that you're using things like two-factor authentication. But as we're going to find out today in this conversation, when it comes to AI, there are new challenges that are coming ahead. And we've got to figure out now what are the best ways of dealing with these challenges, specifically in a cybersecurity context.
Fantastic. So earlier this week, Sophos released the State of Ransomware 2024. And that was a really insightful report, just looking at ransomware in general. And I'm curious whether artificial intelligence has a place in ransomware, both from a security standpoint and an attack standpoint. Is that something you're seeing in, or something you saw in the research that you guys published this week?
In this specific report, we didn't really dive into the artificial intelligence side of things at all. We are very much just interested, and this is a study we've been doing for some years. We're just very much interested in the trends that we're seeing developing, specifically with ransomware attacks. So there are obviously a lot of other attacks that aren't ransomware, but ransomware seems to dominate the headlines most years. But to answer your question, yes, artificial intelligence, it does have some impacts on these attacks as well. The fact is that ransomware is very often the last thing that you'll see with respect to an attack. There are other things that happen prior to a ransomware, the actual encryption and then the ransom demand that occurs post encryption. And there's some data theft along that increasingly as well. But what typically happens is you have other threats that are leading to ransomware. And at the very beginning of that chain, very often can be things like a phishing email that demands credentials. Well, the cybercriminals are getting a lot more adept at using AI and large language models, LLMs, right, for creating these lures, these phishing emails, in order to entice users to click on them and then go on with the rest of the attack chain. Now, on the other side of the fence, the defensive side, we are also able to use AI in an effort to detect the ransomware binaries, so that the actual payloads that are being deployed, we're able to detect those even in stuff that's never been seen before. And that's where AI is very helpful from a defensive side, is being able to recognize something that has never been seen before and mark it as malware and then block it.
Yeah. So I think something I just want to kind of go back to is that artificial intelligence and cybersecurity have kind of been hand in hand for a while now. I know that right now, a lot of our listeners only have encountered artificial intelligence through the likes of ChatGPT and Google Gemini and these mainstream platforms. But it's the cybersecurity sector has been using artificial intelligence for a while now. Am I correct in saying that?
Absolutely, yes. So we've been using it for some time, and it's been a sort of an iterative process.
Yeah.
So when we started looking at artificial intelligence, we're trying to figure out how best to use artificial intelligence and in what products. And for us, it was really around the detection side of things where it
Yeah.
started. Is we wanted to increase our ability to detect never before seen malware, and we wanted to be able to do stuff at scale that prior to artificial intelligence required a lot of human effort. So if you think about the threat labs out there, we have threat intelligence feeds that feed into our lab systems. We have all sorts of inputs that come into our labs, and not just us, obviously, all the other vendors that are out there as well in cybersecurity.
Mhm.
And for very long, I've been in specifically at Sophos for nearly 18 years now. So, I've seen the both sides of this, AI technology revolution, if you will. And back then, we had a lot of analysts that were still using technology to enhance the way they worked, but there was a lot more onus on the human to recognize something that was potentially interesting to then do further research on, and then potentially catch, let's say, a new campaign, a new malware campaign that was underway, and then craft detections out of that. Well, that was time consuming, obviously,
Yeah.
and because it was humans that were operating this system, there wasn't we weren't able to get to as much material, if you will, as we would with the machines. And so now we've got a system whereby the artificial intelligence systems can sift through vast amounts of data, way more than we could ever do with an army of humans, and then highlight the things that are interesting to it so that the humans can then verify and do further research on that, and then maybe use that also as launching points for additional research, maybe adjacent or outside of that. And so that's where it really started. And then obviously, well, may not be obvious to everybody, but obvious to us was, okay, so if it can do that, then let's infuse that in some of our products so that it can do a lot of the heavy lifting on that volume. Really, we're seeing upwards of nearly 500,000 samples of malware a day, right? So that volume was untenable for humans. So let's do that with our products as well, and that's where it started, is with the endpoint product being able to detect never before seen malware.
Yeah, I can imagine that leaning on that on a individual basis, like having an IT team or a infosec team trying to investigate every strain of malware would take weeks, months, years to detect a new strain. So I'm sure that artificial intelligence has helped greatly in that regard. But I'm sure that artificial intelligence and these large language models and machine learning, they're also using it to look for holes in the walls, so to speak.
So thankfully, it doesn't seem like, at least from the cyber criminal side of things, that they're not using it as offensively as they might want to, I think is
Oh,
the best way of putting it. So as far as finding vulnerabilities goes, I think that there's a lot of effort trying to see how to use artificial intelligence to do that well. But I'm not seeing any major inroads specifically on, and if we focus on the cyber criminal side of things, specifically for them, I'm not seeing any major inroads in terms of
oh,
finding new vulnerabilities in existing software, and then using those findings to then further their attacks.
yeah.
What we are seeing specifically is that social side that I mentioned earlier, which is being able to craft better lures in the social aspects of an attack, using the translation capabilities of these LLMs to attack regions of the world where you don't speak the language. They're using it to do research on organizations, on individuals, on even on some technology, right? They will look up and say, we've seen these on forums where they'll use an LLM to look up specific vulnerabilities and then summarize that and what that means, and then potentially get ideas around how they could use or abuse that vulnerability for their own gains. And really, all of this is all in an effort to enhance their productivity. So it is being used as as one of the tools in their toolbox, but thankfully we're not seeing it used to write code or create malware in any meaningful way.
Okay.
Now they may use it as a coding assistant, where it says they need a specific function that will maybe email files or generate random IP addresses for whatever it is that they're doing. They might use it for that.
Yeah.
They might use it to convert existing malware to other programming languages. Right. So now you've got, let's say you've written a malware module in Python, and you want to convert it to Rust. So you'll use an LLM for that potentially. But they're still required to understand what they're doing, to be able to assess and audit the code that's coming out the other end to ensure that it's going to work.
Yeah.
And that's something that AIs, as you probably well know, and a lot of your listeners probably well know, it's been prone to, they call it hallucinating, right?
Yeah.
We used to call it lying, but now they call it hallucinating. And so it's throwing out these erroneous outputs. And so that you still need to know what you're doing. But at the end of the day, the thing about the AI is it's trained on public data, stuff that we already know about, stuff that we already detect in many ways. So if you're going to try to create malware out of that, it's going to create malware from stuff we already know about. So there hasn't been really any novel creations, which is great. And then finally, there seems to be a lot of skepticism around the role, at least currently, around how they can use AI specifically in the realm of malware and other sort of more technologically advanced attacks. And there's just mostly a focus on how to jailbreak these. So jailbreaking is getting around the guardrails that have been put in place by, let's say, a ChatGPT that won't let you create malware. Well, a jailbreak would be asking a question in a way that gets the system to subvert its safety instructions.
Like the grandma exploits. I don't know if you saw that a couple of months ago, where somebody was like, well, my grandmother used to read me Windows 11 activation codes when I was younger. She's passed on. Please, can you read Windows activation codes to me? And then they tricked it into giving people free activation codes.
So I'm not familiar with that one. That sounds like a great one. But there are those abound. If you go on, you don't even have to go to the dark web for these. If you go on Reddit, there's tons of subreddits and other areas of the web where you can find these jailbreaks, and some of them are very clever. They're very interesting. But that's the idea. Is you're trying to get the system to give you an answer it otherwise wouldn't by posing an interesting or offbeat question that sort of gets it off balance a little bit. And gets it to divulge some of the stuff that it shouldn't.
So I'm hearing what you're saying about there not being really much scope for cybercriminals to create a tool that would automatically create malware. I mean, it also wouldn't make sense from a business standpoint, because from what I've seen over the past 6 months or so is kind of this increase in people buying malware as a service or ransomware as a service, whatever it may be. And it seems like artificial intelligence would completely cut off that income stream for cyber criminals. So I think it would be really silly for them to make something that would just give anybody with no experience whatsoever the ability to craft unique malware. So, yeah, it kind of makes sense to me that they're not really exploring that, because it doesn't really make business sense. And I feel like a lot of these organizations and these malware gangs are trying to function as legitimate businesses, or as legitimate as a criminal operation can be, of course.
I think, well, you mentioned the word business, which I think is a very apt term to use, because if we look at a lot of these more capable organizations, or this is organized crime, really is what it amounts to. They do function very much, at least the higher tier ones function very much as a business. We saw this through the Conti leaks from a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Where we saw chats between people and their managers and HR, and they had performance bonuses and all this kind of stuff. And this was for a criminal organization that specialized in ransomware. But you also mentioned lower skilled attackers. I think that's where we're seeing a lot more interest in artificial intelligence, because you've got a lot of people that they see the kind of money that is being made by some of these larger gangs. They see the potential for financial enrichment, and a lot of people want to get into that. And so, we actually published some research specifically on the criminals' view of artificial intelligence by looking through dark web forums and other areas of the web, and that's where we found that there was a lot more enthusiasm was around the less skilled attackers trying to figure out how they could get into this game. And then it seemed like using artificial intelligence was a bit of a shortcut for them.
Mm.
And so for that side of things, it could actually mean in the short term and medium term that, we're going to see a bit of an uptick of low skilled attackers trying to do whatever they can. And this is something when I look at the attack landscape, we do see a lot of that low value, low skill kind of attempts at breaching organizations. And unfortunately, for organizations that aren't as well prepared, meaning they don't have the preventive technologies and the detection capabilities, and finally the response capabilities to deal with some of this stuff, they do end up getting breached and in some cases ransomware, which again, for that final payload, which can be very devastating specifically to small businesses,
Yeah.
ends up on their networks.
So I imagine that there is quite a bit of attraction towards the surge in artificial intelligence solutions we're seeing within businesses. So we started to see that companies are now able to create their own chatbots that draw on their customer data, and I'm wondering whether this is these huge repositories of data that are being used to train these AI models are a temptation to cyber criminals, and whether companies are aware of just how dangerous having these pools of data that, to my mind, need to be somewhat easily accessible, given that AI needs to be able to access them, and you don't want the complications that having all of this behind lock and key brings. I'm wondering whether there's sort of a conversation going on about securing this data properly that is being used to train AI, and whether cybercriminals on the dark web or elsewhere are kind of seeing these huge pools of data that companies are creating and licking their lips in temptation.
It's hard to say whether the companies that are training these models and generating these, or gathering and training on these large data sets, are actually doing the work of securing that data set. I would hope so, right? It's definitely good practice.
Yeah.
And I can say for a fact that at Sophos we do adhere to those principles of making sure that the data is, that we only collect what we absolutely need to in terms of training the whatever model that we're working on, that we're training it with data that's fit for purpose. So if we're training it on detecting malware, well, we're not going to feed it a bunch of extraneous metadata from other places, so it just doesn't belong there and it's not fit for purpose. And we also take it, we do make sure that from the data handling perspective, that we only collect what we need to and then only access and work on what we need to when it's appropriate, and then securing all of that at any step of the way. And that's the way you should do it, right? That's the practice, that the good practice of data in motion, data storage that we've known for many years. But that good practice isn't always followed. And that's why we continue to have data breaches.
Yeah.
I think the deluge of breaches that we've seen in the past decade, if you will, kind of proves that. And to your point, I think PII, personally identifiable information, might be part of that training data set in some cases. And so the companies that are using potentially customer data, the companies that are thinking about potentially using customer data, they need to think about that as how am I going to secure this data set? And well, actually, let's back up. Is this appropriate, right?
Yeah.
Is the data that I'm using for this training data set, is it appropriate and fit for purpose? And is there another way that I can possibly get there without all this personal information potentially? And then if that's the case, if you are working off, let's say, the data set that needs to know your customer base in order to serve them better, fine. But then you have to go through the work of making sure that at every single step of the way, that data is secured, whether it's sitting on a server or whether it's actively being used by the training model or being interfaced with from the outside. Because sometimes this is the kind of thing that you'll allow your partners to query potentially.
Yeah.
because they want to know a little bit more about the customers that you have, so that they can partner with you better and serve that entire customer base as well. So all of this needs to be well thought out. It needs to be, you need to adhere to the security principles that we've laid out in terms of securing data for many years now. You need to adhere to those, as well as thinking about potential future regulatory environments that you're operating in, because we're seeing a lot more interest now from governments and regulators and lawmakers to try to get their hands around artificial intelligence and figure out how to do it in a way that isn't going to expose the public to harms. And so you've got to think of all these things when you're going forward. And I would add transparency to that as well. I think if you are going to be specifically using customer data, it should be part of your terms and conditions. There should be some sort of notification or way for a customer to know that their data is part of that data set, so that if they do want to opt out, then they can.
Yeah. Those are all great points. And that leads me to my next question is, what would you say to a company that wants to use one of these public AI sort of platforms like ChatGPT or Gemini to kind of, like, let's say, for instance, I'm working in a business, I need to summarize some data for a presentation, and I plug all of that into ChatGPT. What's the risk there of doing something like that?
Yeah, so there's a few things that you might want to think about when you're interfacing with some of these systems. Now, there are different ways you can interface with some of these systems. Some are, let's call it public versus private, and just to keep the term simple. And even in a Chat GPT, they do have two sides to their systems, right? There's the public thing that pretty much anybody can query and have chats with. And then there's also a private side, which corporations can use, where they allegedly use sort of private instances of machines that don't add the data that you input into the training data set for future models. Whereas, and this is something that I'm not 100% sure on just the entire back-end infrastructure of a Chat GPT.
It is quite complex.
Yeah, but I do, I've heard and read about there are certain things that are being used in your interactions with these bots to train the future models, right?
Yeah.
So that's something you really need to figure out. And if you're a small company, maybe you're tempted to go with the public side of things. But if you're going to be then, if your inputs are going to be potentially sensitive or personal information, then you really need to think about that, because the potential for a data leak, and to your previous questions about criminals, are they licking their lips over this kind of stuff? Yeah, if I was a criminal and I could get my hands on a data set that included a lot of personal or sensitive information, whether that's an AI model or not, you're going to be interested. So
yeah,
the data leaks are potentially a problem, because somebody else can come along and query the system. And because your data had been put into that public system, they could then get it out again.
Yeah.
Right. There's also the questions. So that's obviously the privacy implications. We have to think about reliability and accuracy as well. Right. So as a company who's going to rely on some of these systems, we talked about hallucinations. Is the information that you're getting out of the system for business purposes reliable and accurate? And we've seen that sometimes not so much, right?
Yeah.
They're even for things that, so I think many people have done this, but I asked ChatGPT to tell me about myself a few times, just to see, iterations over time, but also just to see what it would say. And it got a lot of things right. And then it just kept going and started adding things, places that I've worked at and jobs that I've done that I've never done, right?
Yeah.
And I would know that, but would you? You probably wouldn't, because you don't know me as well, right? So that's the kind of thing that you need to really think about when you're using the systems. There's also training bias. So this is one that's really difficult to judge from the outside. But again, these things are black boxes in many respects, and the companies that are training these systems are training on data sets that we don't necessarily know the entire the entire constituency of all the data that goes in there. We don't know what it is, and so there's training biases that can come out of this with respect to AI. There's dependencies on the product, right? So if you're building your business around a specific chatbot, and all of a sudden, for whatever reason, it goes away, whether it gets bought up by another company or for some reason they just shut the project down. If your product now depends on that chatbot, you could be in a tough spot, right? And like I said before, regulatory compliance. That really needs to be part of the whole decision matrix when it comes to whether we want to use one of these or not. So, the public versus private, obviously public, I think, has a bit more risk to business in terms of the potential harms and the ways it could go wrong. On the private side, I think there's more, there are more assurances around how the data will be handled on the AI side that you can then have, make better decisions around that. But at the end of the day, what are you trying to accomplish? Why are you using one of these things and one of these systems? And you really need to understand that and answer that question for yourself so that you can then explain it to your customers and anybody else who depends on you when it comes to using these artificial intelligence systems.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points, especially the points about what happens if these companies shutter overnight. And that is a real possibility. I mean, I know that these companies are very well established. They're worth billions at this point, possibly trillions. But, I mean, we could have laws come out tomorrow that just outlaw artificial intelligence entirely. I know that is a massive stretch. But it is something that could happen. And like you say, if you've built your business on it, what do you do then? I doubt a lot of people are going to be able to build out the infrastructure needed to power these models because the compute power they need is immense. So
yeah. Less people think that's a bit of a stretch. It's happened before. If we look at the move to cloud some years ago, a lot of companies making IoT devices were reliant on a lot of these third-party clouds, and they went away.
Yeah.
these third-party clouds would go away, and then all of a sudden you've got this IoT light bulb which is stuck in the on position because you can't send it the signal to turn off, right?
Yeah.
So that kind of stuff has happened before. So it's not like we're sitting here in our ivory towers going, hey, be careful, this could happen. No, it has happened.
Yeah. I mean, we had the dot-com bubble burst in the 90s. We've had cryptocurrency and, well, not so much cryptocurrency as a whole, but everybody seemed to have a token at one point just before the 2020s. And that just imploded. So, yeah, there's a real possibility that this could all just go away tomorrow. And I if it were to come from anywhere, in my opinion, it would come from legislation.
Possibly, yeah. And to your point about compute power, I think that's a very good observation, because back to the cybercriminals, one of the reasons I think that we're not seeing a massive sort of flood of bad stuff coming from the cybercriminals out of AI is because it does cost a lot of money, right? There's a lot of NVIDIA video cards to buy to run these big massive clusters that are training on these data sets and then being used as interfaces. And to be fair, data scientists are expensive, right?
Yeah.
The people that are experts in these systems at designing them and tuning them are scientists that have been working on these problems for years and with advanced degrees, and they're very, very good people to have on your team. And that's why I think for now we have I think the good guys have an edge, because we've been able to use the people and the other resources that the technological assets to develop these things. And there are some other models out there that are created that are more of the open source type, but they're not as capable. And I think that's where the cybercriminals they're at that point where, well, it costs too much in terms of time and resources to try to subvert a legitimate AI. So back to jailbreaking, right? The way that a lot of these AIs work is they work on a token system where the amount of input that you you send at the system consumes these tokens that are it's not really like you can buy them, but it's not really akin to dollars. It's just
Yeah.
these tokens that are processing power tokens, if you will.
Yeah.
And so, in order to get as these models are getting better at protecting themselves, you have to consume many more tokens to get to the point where you jailbreak one.
Yeah.
Every once in a while, you find the grandma prompt, and it it just spills its guts right away. But
Um,
that's part of the problem, right? And then the open source models are just the ones that may be a little bit more permissive, just aren't as capable.
just to wrap up, something I do want to just pick your brain about and just maybe explore a bit more is you mentioned that Sophos has in recent years started adding AI to your end user products, and I'm wondering whether AI is sort of a way to democratize the sort of protection that has only really been accessible to enterprises in the past. I know you did touch on it a little bit at the beginning of the conversation, but I'm wondering if we can just tap into that a little bit more, especially with regards to the monitoring, detection, and that sort of aspect of cybersecurity.
Yeah, that's I'm glad you said that, because that is actually one way in which it can be democratized, I think. So if we look at the different areas where you can apply some of this, there's the threat detection and prevention side, which is very much more infused into the products. And so whether you're a 10-person company or a 10,000-person company, right, you're going to get the same product. And so you're going to get the benefit of AI. But where many organizations struggle, and this is something, so I work on an additional report called the Active Adversary Report, where I do an analysis of all the incident response investigations that we do throughout the year. And it's very much looking at real world incidents where companies were the victims of some sort of attack, most of them ransomware, and what were the outcomes, right? In terms, but not just the outcomes, but what were the features of those attacks, so that we can understand some trends. So, what tools were used? How did they get in? What other things that did they contribute to the attack that may not be obvious? Those kinds of things. And what comes out of that very often when I do my analysis is that a lot of people that are trying to do security well, so they've got some, they have some protection, they have some technology, some protective technologies in place, but they are struggling to keep up with that tech, what that technology is telling them.
Mm.
So the telemetry that comes out of these products may be saying, hey, there's a suspicious signal over here and you need to investigate. And a lot of the smaller businesses out there simply do not have the resources at hand to be able to do that.
Yeah.
And I think that's where AI can start to, at least on the cybersecurity product side or services side, can start to really help some of these smaller companies by being, again, looking through large amounts of data set, lots of telemetry being generated from all your different products, putting that in a data lake, and then analyzing the entirety of that telemetry and picking out suspicious signals, elevating those signals to an administrator who can
Mm.
then act on them. And that action could also involve some measure of AI, where we're able to summarize a lot of the alerts that are being generated in very well, easily digested,
Yeah.
human readable outputs, right? And then you can ask questions. So natural language processing, NLP, right, is something where you can then start querying, much like you query the chat bot for ChatGPT, in your own words. Say, hey, so the alert comes up, says we've detected this suspicious event. You can then say, what other systems in my environment, in my network, are showing the same suspicious event, without knowing IP addresses and network segments and specific threat names. It can go out there and go, oh, here are the other 10 systems that I've noticed in the past hour that are exhibiting this same the same suspicious event.
Yeah.
So those are the kinds of ways I think where we can use AI to help the administrators of some small companies that don't have threat hunters. They don't have these threat analysts that do that for a living. We can put a system in place to sort of assist the humans in making, first identifying problem spots and then responding to these issues.
Yeah. I mean that's really really great, and I think it's really important as well, especially given just how pervasive the problem of cybercrime is, and just how many SMEs there are, small businesses there are, and just how often they are targeted. So, like, it would be really great to have a solution, especially for the mom and pops shop down the road, that might be online, might be doing websites or printing or whatever it may be, and their livelihood is threatened because they don't really fully understand cybercrime because they've never had to, and now it's a real problem. So I really like that approach of just making it easier for somebody to identify that there is a problem, and then also how to solve that problem as well. So yeah.
Yeah, and there's a further layer of abstraction as well for the really small organizations that just don't even have the capability to do what I was just describing. There are services that you can consume that will do that for you, right? And obviously those services use some measure of AI as well, just obviously for scale purposes. But yeah, the fact remains that there are the large companies which will have all these capabilities in house very often. Then as we move more down market, we have the ability to infuse some of that capability into products. And then finally, if you're just the type of person that wants to be secure, but your business is not cybersecurity, your business is making boxes, right? Yeah. Well, go make your boxes. We'll do the cybersecurity for you.
Awesome, John. Thank you so much for that. That was really insightful, really informative. Where can people find out more about Sophos?
So if you want to find out more about Sophos, our products and services, go to sophos.com. If you want to read more about the State of Ransomware report, the Active Adversary report, and then any of the other threat research news, you can go to news.sophos.com.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, John, and have a fantastic day further.
Thanks, Brennan.